The fire chief set his coffee down so hard it spilled when he saw the patch on my jacket. I'd sewn it there myself the night before the ceremony because I didn't have anywhere else to put it, and it felt wrong to leave it in a drawer. He was a big man, maybe 60, the kind who'd seen enough house fires to never flinch at anything. But he flinched then. "Where did you get that?" he said. Not a question, really. More like he already knew and was praying he was wrong. "It was my grandmother's," I told him. "She passed in March." He sat back down slowly, like his knees had stopped trusting him, and he looked at me for a long time before he said, real quiet, "We need to talk somewhere private." That was the first moment I understood that the woman my own family had let die alone in a county nursing home, the woman they called a burden right up until the end, might have been somebody I never actually knew. My grandmother's name was Eleanor Pratt, and for most of my life she was just Grandma Nell, the lady who kept butterscotch candies in her apron pocket and watered the same stubborn tomato plants every summer, no matter how many times the deer ate them. She lived alone in a narrow house on Sycamore Street in a small town in western Pennsylvania, the kind of town where the steel mill closed before I was born and never came back. The porch sagged. The wallpaper in the kitchen was from the 70s. She drove a brown Buick that smelled like cough drops, and she never once in 81 years raised her voice that I can remember. To my mother, she was a project that never got finished. To my stepfather, she was an expense. They talked about her in numbers, mostly. How much the home health aid cost, how much the property taxes were on a house worth nothing, how much longer they'd say, and then not finish the sentence, because even they knew how it sounded. When she started getting confused, they didn't move her in with us. They had the room. They had a finished basement that nobody used except to store my stepfather's exercise bike that he rode twice. Instead, they found the cheapest licensed facility within an hour's drive, a place called Maple Ridge that smelled like bleach and boiled vegetables, and they signed the papers and felt, I think, relieved. My mother said it was for Grandma's safety. Maybe part of her believed that. But I drove out there on a Sunday once and found my grandmother sitting alone by a window that didn't open, in a cardigan with somebody else's name written on the tag in marker, and I knew nobody had visited her in a long time. I was 29 and 300 miles away, finishing my last year of a paramedic program in Ohio, working overnight shifts to pay for it. I called her when I could. The calls got harder. Sometimes she knew me right away and we'd talk about my tomatoes, which were really her tomatoes, the cutting she'd made me take. Sometimes she'd ask who was calling and then ask if I'd seen Eleanor lately, talking about herself in the third person like she'd already left the room. I should have driven out more. I'll carry that. The call came on a Tuesday in March. Not from my mother. From a nurse at Maple Ridge, a kind-sounding woman who said my grandmother's breathing had changed and that family should come if they wanted to. I called my mother first. She said she had a closing on a house that week. She's a realtor, and that she'd try to get out there over the weekend. I told her there might not be a weekend. There was a pause, and then she said, "Well, she's comfortable, isn't she?" And that was the closest thing to grief I heard from her. I drove through the night. 5 hours, rain the whole way, my wipers smearing the lights of every truck that passed. I made it to Maple Ridge at 4 a.m, and a nurse let me in, and I sat with my grandmother and held her hand, which was so thin by then it felt like holding a bundle of dry twigs wrapped in paper. She woke up once. Her eyes found me and something cleared in them, just for a second, and she said, "There you are." I kept the light on. I didn't know what light she meant. I told her I loved her. She smiled like she had a secret she'd finally decided not to tell. And she went back to sleep, and a little after 6 a.m, she stopped breathing while I was holding her hand, and I was the only one there. Nobody else came. My mother arrived 2 days later for the arrangements, and the first thing she asked was whether Grandma had any life insurance. She didn't. My stepfather asked, in the parking lot of the funeral home, whether we really needed the more expensive casket, since it was just going in the ground anyway. We buried her on a gray Thursday in the cemetery behind the Lutheran church. 6 people came. Me, my mother, my stepfather, the neighbor lady from Sycamore Street, the pastor, and one old man in a wheelchair who I didn't recognize, who came alone, who didn't speak to anyone, and who left before I could ask his name. My mother spent most of the service checking her phone. I stood at the edge of the grave and felt something go very cold and very still inside me, and it wasn't sadness exactly. It was more like a door closing on people I thought I knew. Afterward, I went back to the house on Sycamore Street to start packing it up, because of course nobody else offered. It was a strange kind of work, going through the small life of a person you loved and finding out how small it really was, at least on the surface. Boxes of canceled checks, a drawer of rubber bands and twist ties she'd saved for 40 years, church cookbooks, a coffee can full of buttons, and in the bottom of her cedar chest, under the good tablecloth she only used at Christmas, wrapped in a square of blue felt, I found the patch. It was a fire department patch, but not from any department I'd ever heard of. No city name, no county, just a shield, and inside the shield a symbol I didn't recognize, a kind of crossed pattern that wasn't crossed axes and wasn't a Maltese cross either, with 3 small stars beneath it. The felt it was wrapped in had a date written on it in my grandmother's hand, a date in 1961, the year before my mother was born. I sat on the floor of that bedroom and turned it over and over. My grandmother had never once in my life mentioned being a firefighter. She was a school cafeteria-lady. That's what we all knew. 40 years serving lunch to children. I'd seen the hairnet. I'd seen the ladle. But I remembered, sitting there, something I'd buried. When I was maybe 12, there was a grease fire in her kitchen, a pan that caught while she was frying donuts for the church. I screamed. She didn't. She covered the pan, killed the burner, moved everything flammable away from the stove, and had it dead in under 30 seconds, calm as a person turning off a faucet, and when it was over, she just looked at me and said, "Never water, never panic," and went back to her coffee like nothing happened. I thought she was just an unflappable old lady. I took the patch. My mother never asked about the house, what was in it, what I'd found. She listed it within a month. My stepfather said the lot was worth more than the structure and they'd probably tear it down. I went back to Ohio and back to my last clinical rotations and tried to fold the whole thing away the way you learn to fold things away in emergency medicine. But the patch sat on my dresser and I couldn't stop looking at it. So when my program held its pinning ceremony that spring, the formal one where they bring in fire and EMS brass from across the region to hand us our credentials, I sewed the patch onto the inside of my dress jacket near the heart, where no one would see it but me. I wanted her there somehow. That's the only reason. I wasn't expecting anyone to recognize it. I wasn't expecting the fire chief had come to speak, a man named Walter Brennan, who'd run a big city department for 30 years, to walk past me at the reception, stop dead, set down his coffee, and ask me where I got it like I'd shown him a ghost. He took me to a side room off the banquet hall, the kind with stacked chairs and a coffee maker, and he closed the door. He asked me to say her name again. "Eleanor Pratt," I told him. "Eleanor. Margaret Pratt." He nodded slowly and asked if she ever went by Nell. I said yes, everyone called her Nell. And this big man, this chief who'd been first into burning buildings for 3 decades, put his hand over his mouth for a second like he needed to keep something in. "I never met her," he said finally. "But I know that patch. My father wore one just like it. He'd have taken it to the grave before he explained it, but he told me once near the end what it meant." He sat down across from me. In the late 50s and into the 60s, there were a handful of people, almost no records of it now, who got pulled into something the government doesn't really talk about. Civil defense was the public name for it. But there was a quieter piece. After the big plant explosions, the experimental reactor problems, the things that happened at facilities that officially didn't have accidents, somebody had to go in. Not soldiers. Civilians who knew fire, knew chemicals, knew how to keep a thing from getting worse. They weren't allowed to talk about where they'd been. A lot of them were women, actually, because the men were needed elsewhere, and because nobody suspected a woman with a casserole dish of having been the person who walked into a contaminated building so a whole county didn't have to evacuate. I told him that couldn't be my grandmother. My grandmother served lunch to children for 40 years. He looked at me and said, gently, "What better cover is there than a woman everybody decides is ordinary?" I drove back to Ohio that night with the patch in my pocket instead of my jacket, and the whole way I kept rearranging my grandmother in my head and nothing fit the way it used to. The frugal house that was never quite as poor as it looked. The way she paid cash for everything and kept no debt and somehow always had exactly enough. The way she never, ever let her photograph be taken. How there were maybe 4 pictures of her in existence and she's looking away in all of them. I thought she was shy. I called my mother when I got home, even though it was late. "Do you remember Grandma's old patch?" I asked. "A fire patch in her cedar chest?" There was a long silence. "She had all kinds of junk in there," my mother said finally. "Why?" "A fire chief recognized it tonight. He acted like it meant something, like it mattered." My mother laughed, but it was thin. "Honey, your grandmother liked to make herself sound mysterious. She did it your whole childhood. She'd say these things and let you imagine. It made her feel important. There's nothing behind it." That word stayed with me. Behind. Like there was a thing and I was being told to stop looking at it. "She covered a grease fire in 30 seconds when I was 12, I said. "She wasn't scared of fire. Ever. She was a cafeteria worker," my mother said in the flat voice she uses to end conversations. "Let her rest. Worry about your own life." My stepfather was worse when I brought it up that weekend. He got that put-upon look he gets. "Your grandmother," he said, "was a difficult, secretive woman who liked having something over the rest of us. Always hinting, always acting like she knew things. It was manipulative, frankly." I said she might have done something real, something important. He said, "Lots of people do important things. Does it mean we have to throw a parade?" And I wanted to say, "You couldn't even throw her a funeral. You wanted the cheap casket." But I didn't, because I already knew there was nothing in him that would hear it. The truth is, they treated her like furniture my whole life. She wasn't invited to my high school graduation because, my mother said, the tickets were limited, though somehow there were enough for my stepfather's golf buddy. At Thanksgiving, she sat at the end of the table and people talked over her. My stepfather once joked that the most exciting thing Nell ever did was burn the church donuts, and the whole table laughed, and she laughed too, softly, and looked out the window, and I remember thinking she laughed like someone who knew a much funnier joke and had decided to keep it. I did the thing my family never did. I went looking. I reached out to an old contact from my EMS training, a retired federal disaster coordinator who'd lectured us once, and I described the patch to him over the phone. He went quiet for a moment, the way Chief Brennan had. "I've seen that mark exactly once," he said, "in a file I wasn't supposed to be in. It's not for public history. Put it this way. It's proof of work that officially didn't happen." When I asked what kind of work, he said, "The kind where if it went right, you never heard about it. And if it went wrong, you really never heard about it." Then he told me to be careful who I asked, and he hung up. A week later, an email came from an address with no name attached. It said only that the writer had served alongside Owen or Pratt, that the writer was now very old, and that if I was willing to drive, there were things I deserved to know. It was signed Harlan. The wheelchair, I thought. The old man at the funeral who left before I could speak to him. I didn't tell my mother. I drove out the next Saturday to an address 2 towns over from Sycamore Street, a little brick house with a flag on the porch and ramps where the steps used to be. Harlan was the man from the funeral. 91 years old, oxygen line in his nose, hands that shook, eyes that didn't. He had me sit across from him at a kitchen table with a single, faded photograph on it, 8 young people in plain coveralls standing in front of a concrete building with no signs, and one of them, second from the left, hands clasped in front of her, looking off to the side exactly the way she did in every photo I'd ever seen, was my grandmother at maybe 25. "I came to her funeral," he said, "because I owed her my life, and I figured I was the last one left who knew it. There were 8 of us. There are 2 now, and the other one doesn't remember his own name anymore." He tapped the photo. 1961. There was a fire at a facility upstate that the public was told was a fertilizer warehouse. It wasn't. There were materials inside that, if the fire reached them, would have made a good piece of 3 counties unlivable for a long, long time. The regular departments couldn't be told what was really in there. We could. Your grandmother went in third on the line, and when the man ahead of her went down from the heat, she pulled him out and went back in. That was me. She went back in after pulling me out to finish closing the thing off. Because if she didn't, none of it mattered. He looked at me. She was 25. She did that. And she signed a paper afterward that said she'd never speak of it, and as far as I know, she never did. Not to her husband, not to your mother, not to you. I asked him why she kept the patch then, if she could never explain it. He smiled, and his smile was so much like hers it hurt. Because somebody told all of us we'd done nothing, he said. And the patch was the one thing that told her she hadn't. She told me once, years back at a reunion, before the reunion stopped happening because we stopped being enough people to have one, she said she kept it so she'd remember she was real. That the world telling you you're ordinary over and over, you start to believe it. The patch was how she argued back. I thought of her saying, never water, never panic, over a pan of burning grease. I thought of her sitting at the end of the Thanksgiving table laughing at her own joke. It reminds me who I am. She never said those words to me, but she might as well have. I understood, finally, the light she'd kept on. There was a folder under the photograph. Harlan slid it across to me. Some of it got declassified about 15 years ago, he said. Nobody went looking, so nobody found it. But it's there, if you want to prove it. To yourself. To them. Inside were a few pages, names blacked out, but one line near the bottom wasn't, a commendation that had never been delivered to anyone, listing 8 initials, and the third set was EMP, and beside it the words for actions resulting in the prevention of catastrophic civilian loss, and a date in 1961. I sat in my car outside Harlan's house for a long time before I could drive. Then I went back to my mother's, and I put the photograph and the folder on her kitchen table. The same table where my stepfather had made the donut joke, and I told her everything. Harlan. The fire. The man my grandmother pulled out who was sitting in a wheelchair 2 towns away, alive for 64 extra years because of her. The 8 of them. The paper she signed at 25 and kept for the rest of her life. My mother didn't say anything for a while. She picked up the photograph. Her hands started to shake the way Harlan's did. She used to tell me, she said quietly, when I was little, that I shouldn't be afraid of things because she'd seen worse than anything I'd ever see, and that it was all fine now. I thought she was just being a mother. She set the photo down. I thought she was making it up. I told you she made things up. You put her in Maple Ridge, I said. I didn't say it cruel. I just said it. I know what I did, my mother said. And that was the first true thing I'd heard from her about my grandmother in my whole life. We didn't fix everything that night. That's not how it goes. My stepfather sat in the other room and didn't come in, and I think he never fully understood, because some people can't. But my mother started calling Harlan. She'd drive out and sit with him, and he'd tell her the things her own mother never could, and she'd come home and call me, and her voice would be different, smaller, and more honest. She had Grandma's grave marker changed. It had said only her name and her dates. My mother had them add a line beneath it. Not her rank, because there wasn't one. Not the fire, because you still can't really tell it. Just 3 words my grandmother would have liked, I think, the most ordinary 3 words for the least ordinary woman. She kept watch. Harlan passed that autumn. I drove out for his funeral, and there were more people there than at my grandmother's, and I was glad of it, and a little angry that the order hadn't been reversed. I wore the patch on the inside of my jacket again, near the heart. Before they closed his casket, I tipped the felt square with my grandmother's handwriting on it, the 1961, and I tucked it in beside him because they'd gone in together when they were 25, and it seemed right that a piece of her go with him now. I'm a paramedic now. I work the overnight rig in a county not unlike the one where my grandmother served lunch to children for 40 years. I run calls all night, and most of them no one ever hears about. The ones that go right, the quiet saves, the people who get to wake up the next morning and never know how close it was, or who was kneeling over them in the dark. I used to think I wanted the other kind of work, the kind with commendations and people clapping. I don't anymore. I learned where I got this from. When I started my training, I thought the measure of a person was how loudly the world said your name back to you. My family believed that completely. They measured everything that way, in closings and commissions and the size of the casket, and so when they looked at a small woman in a cardigan who never bragged and never explained, they decided there was nothing to see, and they let her sit alone by a window that didn't open. And they let her die 300 miles from the only person who came. They were wrong about her. For a long time, so was I. So here is what I'd ask you. Whoever you are, listening to this, somewhere near you, there is a quiet one. The aunt who changes the subject when you ask about the old days. The neighbor who fixes things on your porch and waves off the thank you. The grandmother at the end of the table laughing at a joke only she understands. Go sit with them. Ask them once, gently, and then be quiet long enough that they could answer if they wanted to. You may get nothing. You may get a story that rearranges everything you thought you knew. But do it before there's a window that won't open and a light left on for nobody. Do it while they can still feel you paying attention, because the bravest people I have ever known never raise their voices, and the world is full of them. And most of them will go into the ground with the whole of what they did wrapped in blue felt, at the bottom of a chest, waiting for one person to care enough to look. I cared enough, in the end, just barely in time to understand, and too late to say thank you, the way she deserved. Don't let it be too late for yours. For most of my life, I measured people the way my mother taught me to, by how loud the world said their name back. That was the mistake that cost us Eleanor. Nobody decided to be cruel to her on purpose. It happened one small choice at a time. A graduation ticket that went to a golf buddy instead of her. A Thanksgiving where we talked over the woman at the end of the table. A cheaper room at Maple Ridge because the better one cost more and she wasn't going to last long anyway. None of those were villainous. That's the frightening part. You don't lose someone like my grandmother in one big act of neglect. You lose her in 100 quiet ones. And by the time you understand what you threw away, the window won't open and the light is left on for nobody. What I learned, kneeling on the floor of that house with a fire patch in my hands, is that being a good person isn't about how you treat the people who can do something for you. It's how you treat the ones who can't, the ones the world has already decided are ordinary. My family failed that test for 40 years. Eleanor passed it every single day in silence, expecting nothing back. She pulled Harlan out of a burning building when she was 25 and then served lunch to other people's children for the rest of her life and never once asked anyone to clap. I also learned that the truth doesn't announce itself. It waits in the cedar chest under the Christmas tablecloth for someone curious enough to keep asking after everyone else has stopped. My mother stopped asking decades ago. She decided she already knew her mother and closed the book. I almost did the same. The only reason I know who Eleanor really was is that I refused to accept the easy answer, drove out to Harlan's kitchen, opened the folder, pay attention to the quiet ones, yes, but also have the nerve to look twice at the story you've been handed about them. And the last thing, maybe the hardest. Doing the right thing usually isn't dramatic. It's a 5-hour drive through the rain to sit with someone so they don't go alone. It's sewing a patch near your heart where no one will see it. It's changing a grave marker because your mother finally had the courage to admit what she did. Strength like Eleanor's doesn't look like strength from the outside. It looks like a small woman in a cardigan covering a grease fire without flinching and going back to her coffee. So go sit with your quiet one. Ask once, gently, then be still long enough that they could answer. Be kind to the people who can give you nothing. Keep asking questions when the easy answer would let you off the hook. And when the moment comes that asks something hard of you, choose the harder, quieter right thing. I learned all of it from a cafeteria lady who kept watch over the world and asked no one to notice. I noticed too late to thank her. Don't.